Today, as I speak to you, it is the 11th of July. In 3 days' time, the French will be celebrating their national day, their great day, the one day of the year which brings out everybody in their finery to celebrate. What are they celebrating? They're celebrating the storming of the Bastille 231 years ago. Storming of the Bastille is one of those events which everybody feels they know about, and the minute you mention the big event with which they're associated, they come out with a phrase. So if you say French Revolution, people, they say, oh yes, storming of the Bastille. Or even more likely, they'll say, oh yes, the guillotine, the Reign of Terror. Well, the Reign of Terror didn't come till 1793 or 4. Bastille was stormed in 1789. So the first proverbial reaction is the storming of the Bastille. In the same way, if you talk about one of Rome's great enemies, ancient Rome's great enemies, Hannibal, what will everybody say? Oh, yes, elephants. As if everybody knows all about that. As if it was the elephants that won the war. In fact, when they'd all finished crossing the Alps, nearly all of them except one were dead, so they couldn't possibly have won the war. In the same way, you talk about the Napoleonic Wars. Yes, people know two things about that. Battle of Trafalgar, glorious victory for us. Battle of Waterloo, another glorious victory for us. But the wars between France and England, in fact, went on for 22 years. But no, it's Trafalgar and Waterloo. So, with the French Revolution, it's the Reign of Terror. Or, beforehand, and that's the one I want to talk about, the storming of the Bastille. Well, what was the Bastille? Chances are a lot of you have seen pictures of it. It's in every other school textbook. An enormously lofty, forbidding building, a castle, obviously, built to overawe people. In fact, the pictures of it, because of the events associated with it, because it attains such a, well, they use the word iconic now, don't they? Such an iconic status in French history and in people's imagination. It's always drawn in such a way that the perspective makes it look much higher than it really was. Apparently, it was 100 yards, 100 feet high, 30 yards high, not all that tall. Now, it was nevertheless built as a fortress. It was built in the 100 Years' War against the English, so blame it all on the damned English again. It was a way of defending France. One of the great wall around Paris was to be strengthened with this fortress. In those days, they called a fortress a Bastille, and it became corrupted slightly into Bastille, and that's how we know it, the Bastille. Is it Bastille or Bastille? I don't know. There are many towns in southern France which still have the word Bastille in their name because of the 100 Years' War with England. Because of the status it achieved in the French Revolution, and because it has such a forbidding presence, you can imagine in Paris in the 18th century, it must have loomed over everything all the time, night and day, always there. A tremendously powerful image. So understandably, people were in awe of it, people told stories about it, every other legend about it was believed, the horror stories multiplied with each century. What's it got to do with the revolution? Well, we're coming to that any minute now. In fact, although it was built as a fortress and was subsequently used as a prison, it was used as an archive too, and in the end as an arsenal. Weapons and powder were stored there. But it was used as a prison, but by the end of the century, apparently very, very, very few French prisoners were in fact kept there. Its use as a prison declined as the 18th century went on. In fact, it was so little used that as late as the 1780s, there were discussions at quite a high level as to whether the Bastille justified all the expense Look at the size of the building, look at the height of the building, look at the cost of the maintenance, look at the cost of the garrison, feeding it, supplying it, protecting it, getting a water supply, everything. So a lot of people were wondering, was it really worth all the trouble? So 1789, as you know, is the date given for the French Revolution. How can I describe the French Revolution to you in just a few minutes? Well, of course, it's impossible. It's like being asked to describe the Second World War in 5 minutes. You can't. So anything I say is going to be inadequate. But what had happened in the 1780s, the French had fought a war with Britain again. The French had joined in the American War of Independence. And they'd won for once. We had lost the colonies, and the French did rather well out of the increased honour and glory. Anything that put it over on the damned English must be a good thing. But in the end, it wasn't, because the cost of the war for the French was absolutely crippling. And they spent the next few years after 1783, when the war ended, working out a way to deal with this deficit. I haven't got the time or the space to tell you all the things that were tried, except to say that they all failed. In the end, in desperation, it was suggested that the French ought to summon a parliament, which may strike a country like England, which has had a parliament for several centuries, as a bit odd. But the French didn't operate like that. The French monarchy was absolutist. The king's word was law. As Louis XIV said, "L'État, c'est moi." There had been a French parliament of sorts, but the last time it had met was in 1614, 170 odd years before. So understandably, people's memories were a bit rusty. When it finally did assemble, you can imagine the doubt and confusion. Nobody knew what had been going on before. Nobody obviously had survived from the previous one. There were no rules about procedure. The aristocracy didn't want it anyway because they were afraid they might lose their liberties once a parliament got to work. The clergy, also equally privileged, they disapproved of it as well. The only ones who were keen on the idea were, in effect, everybody else, the people, what they called the third estate. There were three estates: the clergy, number one, the nobility, two, and the people, the third estate, three. They set up shop in May, continued debating in a frantic, disjointed, purposeless sort of way right through the summer. Again, we haven't got time to go into the details, but it was a hot summer, and the harvest was late. Bread prices started soaring, so you not only had the confusion of the French Parliament, what they called the Estates General, the three estates, remember. So you had the confusion of the debates, the exasperation of so many people that nothing appeared to be happening, the excitement of ordinary people who felt that after such a long time, after 175 years, something might actually be going to happen. And it gave the opportunity for so much resentment to come out as well against the clergy and against the nobility, who had been enjoying all sorts of, frankly, unfair privileges for centuries. It's a bit like you'll get incidents on the television we've had one only recently in which a black man was beaten to death. This brought out tremendous resentment, excitement, demonstrations, a great deal of talk about racism, a great expression of the idea that this ran very, very deep. Well, the same thing happened in Paris in 1789. A lot of that resentment started to come up, which had run so deep for so long. So it was a very volatile time. Crowds began to form on certain days because of rumors, because of local riots, which escalated. It's very difficult to explain how a crowd actually forms. You look at the television news bulletins. Where do all these crowds come from? all you see is an instant shot of a city street, and there are thousands, tens of thousands milling around all over. Where do they come from? Who are they? You could ask the same question about crowds in Paris in 1789. They didn't have any recognized leaders. They had no recognized program. It was all very much, let's do this, chaps, let's do that, chaps. Everything was done spontaneously. It was all very excitable. All he needed was some loudmouth in a street corner to say, let's go and do so-and-so, and they did. Let's loot this gunsmith's shop. Let's go and raid that baker because we want to be fed with some bread, and so on and so on. And there was a great fear that the aristocracy, led by the king, although Louis was personally very popular, but everybody was suspicious of what the nobles around him might do. They knew that the nobles didn't want the revolution. Therefore, they darkly suspected, with some justification, that the nobility would do something to try and scotch the revolution, la révolution. There will be a counter-revolution. And dark suspicions were put about, rumors were spread that there were large troop movements of royalist armies in the area, and they were going to be told to march on Paris and kill off the revolution. So they wanted to be defended. Again, we have this business of how do you get a mob to do something? How does a crowd become a mob? Who is it who stands on the street corners and says, let's go and get some of them? I know where they are, says somebody, and off they go to a building called Les Invalides, still there. It was said that this was a huge weapons store. They were going to get guns and powder to defend themselves against these armies who were marching on Paris to kill the precious revolution. Well, they got to Les Invalides. It's a sort of army pensioners, hostel, hospital, assembly group, whatever you care to call it. A bit like Chelsea pensioners, I suppose. They found the guns all right, but they didn't find the powder. And then again, somebody else said, oh, they've got powder at the Bastille. It's an arsenal. Let's go there. So they marched on the Bastille. Of course, word was getting around that there were mobs on the rampage, this particular one from the Bastille, and word got ahead that the Bastille might be under attack. And the governor of the Bastille had to make some preparations. Unfortunately, it appears that he was really the last person to be able to organize the defense and take some difficult decisions. By an amazing irony, he had been born in the Bastille. His father had been the governor, and he'd been raised there. Whether he spent all his life there or not, I don't know. But he had succeeded to the governorship, which had been held by his father. He too wanted to take some precautions. He knew there was a lot of powder, and he ordered all the barrels, 250 of them. Imagine the amount of gunpowder to be put down in the dungeons. Bastille, at least, was not short of dungeons. They knew that. But the gates, of course, were shut. There was a drawbridge that was pulled up naturally. And the revolutionary government of Paris decided we must do this properly. The mob couldn't break in. There was a massive outside courtyard open to the mob. Then there was a big gate, the drawbridge, and then there was an inside courtyard. And the Hotel de Ville sent a couple of delegates to negotiate with the governor for the surrender of the Bastille. Here we enter almost Whitehall farce. They arrived halfway through the morning when the governor, Delaunay, was having his lunch. Apparently they lunched very early, déjeuner. And Delaunay, being an hospitable man, invited them to join him for lunch in the Bastille with a mob howling outside while they negotiated some kind of arrangement governing surrender or handing over of the powder. Delaunay said he couldn't hand over the powder because he had to get permission from Versailles, where the French court and headquarters were. So we have, what do you call it, a deadlock of one kind or another. This went on till lunchtime, till the real lunchtime, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock. The mob got worse, got more impatient. The two delegates didn't appear to achieve anything. Some more delegates went along. Delaunay, the governor, moved some cannon. There were lots of cannons in the courtyard and right up on the battlements, which could be trained down on the mob. So they had something else to be afraid of, something else to be suspicious of. Was Delaunay going to invite them in to the inner courtyard, not to negotiate, but simply to mow them down with cannon, load them with grape shot? You could kill hundreds of people at a time. They didn't know. They suspected Delaunay, they suspected the king's ministers, they suspected the queen, they suspected everybody. It was a very volatile situation. Delaunay didn't help matters by dithering. He was not known for his decisive behaviour. At one time, he threatened to blow the Bastille up. He threatened to set off all the gunpowder in the cellars, in the dungeons. Can you imagine 250 barrels of gunpowder going up all at the same? Oh, I mean, there were Paris suburbs all around. It wasn't out on its own. They could have killed thousands of people. Then, again, I've had to leave out some details, and somebody will no doubt correct me and tell me that I've got some details wrong. Somebody climbed up the drawbridge, loosed the chains, and the drawbridge collapsed, which was what was intended. Some unfortunate devil was underneath. He got killed. Somebody else was hurt, but the mob charged over the drawbridge into the inner courtyard, and serious fighting began. Some of the Chelsea pensioners, les Invalides pensioners, started firing. Some of the mob started firing, and Delaunay was caught. He tried to get out, was caught by the mob, and some of them were going to drag him off to the Hotel de Ville, decide what to do with him. By this time, the mob was so crazed, human emotions now were at fever pitch, and it seemed to be fairly obvious that Delaunay was not going to get away with his life. Even he realized that it was up, but he struggled desperately, lashing out with arms and feet. And by an amazing coincidence, one of the mob beside him, they've even recorded his name, Denot, I think, a pastry cook. He caught Denot right smack in the groin, doubled him up. That somehow set off a reaction in the people immediately around him. Out came the daggers and the bayonets, and poor Delaunay was stabbed all over the place, far worse than Julius Caesar. And if he wasn't dead by that time, another half dozen people emptied their pistols into him. So that was the end of Delaunay. The mob had arrived, incidentally, carrying on pikes all sorts of heads, but wax heads. They had looted a waxworks and picked up, or stolen, looted, the wax heads of various contemporary celebrities, stuck them on pikes, and were taking them through the streets to the Bastille. But once the mob had gone crazy, once the deaths had begun, once the hated Delaunay had been killed, the obvious thing to do was to chop off his head. Somebody gave Denot, the ex-pastry cook, who had recovered from his shattered groin, gave him a sword and said, "You chop his head off. You were the one he kicked." Denot tried, failed, and unbelievably did the job with his pocket knife. He took off Delaunay's head with his pocket knife. Don't ask me how, but he did. This is a very good example of things that happened in the French Revolution. In amongst all the politics and the ideals and the theories and the philosophy and everything else, there were some very nasty things as well. So this time, the wax heads were taken off the pikes, and real heads. There were some other victims as well. They too had their heads chopped off and stuck on the pikes. And the mob naturally celebrated. And this went on until the evening. Then late in the evening, it rained very hard. And rain is a great damper, literally, of excited feelings. And so in the end, everybody went home. What had been achieved? Historians have been debating that ever since. Hundreds, thousands of books have been written about the storming of the Bastille, and even more important, the importance of the storming of the Bastille. It seems to be, looking back, one of those events which, of course, takes everybody by surprise, comes right out of the blue, but it stands history on its head. I gave a talk a little while ago about the American War of Independence, in which a British general, Burgoyne, was forced to surrender his army to the Americans. And it was only halfway. I mean, the war had another 4 or 5 years to go, but it was the turning point. It was the pivot. It was the hinge. In a similar sort of way, the Bastille was very significant, not because of what, I mean, only 100 people were injured or killed, right, 100, but nevertheless, the figure was not very high. But a good example of the people of Paris realizing, well, the classic example of the people of Paris realizing that they were powerful, that they could do things, and that the forces against whom they had ranged themselves were perhaps not so mystically omnipotent as they had hitherto become accustomed to believing. It set off all sorts of trains of thought in all sorts of people's heads. So we hadn't seen the last of the mob after the Bastille. I'd like to finish off with just 2 or 3 odd little tail pieces to this. One, a great anticlimax. One of the things, obviously, that the mob wanted to do when they broke, well, the first one, obviously, was get the powder. Second thing, of course, was to open up all the cells and let out the hundreds and hundreds of poor wretches who had been languishing there, shackled to the wall for years, decades. The total number that they found, in fact, was 7. 4 of them were forgers, proven guilty, and naturally serving out their time. One had been put there at the request of his family. Apparently, he'd been guilty of some extremely unpleasant sexual crimes, and his own family had had him locked up. That left 2, and they were both lunatics. They should be by rights have been in the lunatic asylum just up the road. I'm not quite sure why they were not, but anyway, they let out the 2 lunatics, one of whom, incidentally, thought he was Julius Caesar. And they carried him about the streets, and he waved to the crowd, thinking that they were giving Julius Caesar the adulation to which he was entitled. Second little tail piece concerned a builder and contractor and demolitions expert who lived in Paris, Pierre-Francois Palouet. And he saw an opportunity. Within 24 hours, he had gone to the authorities at the Hotel de Ville and had signed a contract which gave him complete, utter, total rights for the demolition of the Bastille. He was already in a pretty fair way of business. With remarkable speed and efficiency, he conjured up a labour force, the books say, of 1,000, which is difficult to believe, but that's what they say. And he proceeded to take the Bastille, quite literally, to pieces. And this was in July, remember? And apparently by November, he'd pretty well done the job. It had been gutted. So he must have been pretty jolly efficient. But that was only half of it. Palouet had all this stone and proceeded to sell it off for construction purposes. I believe one of the newer bridges in Paris was later to contain a great deal of stone taken from the Bastille. But it's what he did afterwards that was interesting. He now embarked on a massive sales and promotion program, chopping up bits of the Bastille, literally breaking them all up into souvenirs. They made paperweights, they made scale models of the Bastille, dozens of them. They made snuff boxes, they made inkwells iron ink wells, which they claimed were made from the fetters which had chained these poor souls to the wall. They even put on show chunks of what they said was the crust taken off the walls and the vaults of the cells. What was the crust made of? The crust was made from the joint breath, sweat, and blood of the prisoners, which had caked itself onto those walls and ceilings. And this was all broken up and exhibited all over France. I don't know if any of you remember when they had the moonwalk in the late 1960s. You could go to the Natural History Museum and see bits of the moon. Same idea. He even arranged to have traveling exhibitions. There were new arrangements for local government in France. They set up new local authorities. They called them départements. There were 83. And Palouet, nothing if not thorough, put together 83 traveling exhibitions who went all over every département in France with these exhibitions of scale models and souvenirs and knickknacks and bits and pieces. He even had a set of dominoes made out of the Bastille for the royal family. I don't know if they ever played with them. Now then, was it therefore this man Palouet who, more than anybody else, is responsible for the legend of the Bastille? Is it this which drove the Bastille into the subconscious of the French, and subsequently into the subconscious of everybody else? Everybody's heard of the Bastille, the fall of the Bastille. There's a place in Paris now, of course, it is La Place de la Bastille. There's a bit of it still there on show. Is Palouet the man responsible? Was it he who built the legend of the Bastille? And the third little byproduct, the third tailpiece, understandably, because of the huge significance of it, the great symbolic presence of the Bastille has been stormed. We have got rid of the hated 3-century-old oppression of the Ancien Regime. We've destroyed it. Understandably, people of Paris wanted to go and see. They wanted to wander over the ruins and have a good gawp at what had been done. And there were tourists, Palouet again, organized tourists and guides who produced lurid, vastly over-exaggerated accounts of all the things that were on show for the Parisians to enjoy. And one of the crowd was a young woman who went there like everybody else. She was an apprentice in a waxworks, oddly enough. And she went to see for herself like everybody else. And it would appear that part of the staircase was not very secure. Perhaps the balustrade had gone. She slipped and very nearly fell off the staircase down into the well of the Bastille. And by very good fortune, the gentleman behind her grabbed her hand just in time, saved her life. So inevitably, she turned to him and said, "Thank you, sir. To whom am I indebted?" And he said, "My name is Maximilian Robespierre." Think what happened to him later on, and think who might have made a wax model of his head. The girl was called Marie Curtius. She survived, as I said. Later on, went back to work in the waxworks, was clever and a good businesswoman, and in the end finished up in charge of the waxworks herself. Got married and proceeded to develop the industry. Unfortunately, her husband proved to be a great letdown. He was a bad man of business. He was a bad husband. He was totally irresponsible and totally unreliable. And so she virtually gave up on him and ran the business herself. But she didn't run the business under her maiden name of Marie Curtius. She ran the business under the name of her husband. And there are not many people who have not heard of Madame Tussaud.